like to introduce you to today's moderator. Uh, so today's moderator is Steve Glazier. He is a broadcast meteorologist at Weather Nation, covering the top national weather headlines. He loves looking up and being fascinated by what the sky has to offer. And with that being said, Steve, I give the floor to you.
Oh, joining a couple of weeks later. We're supposed to be 2 Tuesdays ago, but we had Idalia, so we'll talk about that. So I appreciate everybody with their flexibility to join us on this Tuesday, and this is really at the peak of the hurricane season. So here to talk about it, I want to invite our guest. It's Dr. Ryan Truchelut. He is the co-founder and president and chief meteorologist of Tiger Weather. And Ryan graduated, and Ryan, I don't get to say this often, summa cum laude. Is that right?
Yep.
From Princeton University. I'm reading my notes here just to make sure I get Ryan's bio correct. Bachelor's degree in geosciences, got his master's and doctoral from Florida State University in meteorology, so FSU. And his research is focused on tropical cyclone risk, seasonal forecasting, predictive analytics. And he's been presenting at numerous national and international meteorology conferences. So that is pretty cool, especially to go internationally. So Ryan, thanks for your time today.
Oh, thanks. Well, I really appreciate the invite, Stephen. And yeah, I enjoyed some interesting travels as a grad student for sure. So it was an interesting life. But now I'm in the private sector at WeatherTiger, and I'm in Tallahassee, Florida. So we'll get into why the webinar, the original date of the webinar, had to be postponed. So let me share my screen here, and I'll start my presentation. Beginning, there we go. Okay, does that look good, Stephen?
Yeah, that looks good. That looks good on my side. I like how you did the strike through on nearing. We're at the peak.
Well, I'm a hurricane climatologist, so I had to be accurate. I had to lay it down. We'll get into a little bit of hurricane climatology tonight, and we're also going to discuss the expectations for the rest of September and for October, the second half of the hurricane season. So I'll dive right into it. So let's go ahead. And here was the original promotion for nearing the peak, when we were actually still nearing the peak, and that was an accurate way because the original date for this presentation was supposed to be August 29th. Well, what was I up to on August 29th that necessitated postponing the seminar? Well, here is WeatherTiger World Headquarters up here in Tallahassee, and this is 11 o'clock on Tuesday, August 29th, and here is Category 3 at the time, Hurricane Idalia, very much on a trajectory in the direction of my house. So I was a little preoccupied on the 29th, and this is a loop from Brian McNulty at University of Miami of what happened the rest of the night and then into the day on the 30th. And fortunately for me, Idalia did bend off into some more rural counties here to Tallahassee's east. So Tallahassee did not get it that badly in Idalia. We had wind gusts of 55, maybe locally 60 miles an hour. The areas to our east that got the core of Idalia got wind gusts of 100 miles per hour or more. It briefly peaked out as a Category 4, made landfall as a 3. In fact, the first ever Category 3 hurricane to ever make landfall in this part of Florida. So a very weird storm climatologically, but it's been a very strange hurricane season, as we'll get into. So, with that, moving on to the next slide here. Yes, so we have rescheduled for September 12th. And fortunately, hurricanes are not putting Florida under the gun right now. There is, of course, a threat to eastern New England. I'll talk briefly about later, but I have a little bit of time and space to talk about the future instead of just or the 1 to 2 month future instead of the immediate future here. So I want to start by kind of orienting you, the audience, to the near history of what we've gone through in the United States, and specifically really along the Gulf Coast. So I'm in Tallahassee, Florida, right about in here. And the last 3 hurricane seasons have just been brutal along the Gulf Coast. Really, really unusual, the amount of activity that we've seen. 2020 through 2022 have brought 26 U.S. named storms landfalls, just in the continental United States, 11 hurricane landfalls, 4 major hurricane landfalls, and 3 of those major hurricanes were Category 4 hurricanes that made landfall with 150 mile per hour sustained winds, well into the Cat 4 range. And that adds up to $235 billion in US damages, roughly, which is the highest 3-year total ever. We've never seen this much hurricane damage in the continental US added up over 3 years total. Most of that, or about half of it, about $115 billion is from Ian last year. Laura and Ida, of course, were big contributors to that as well. So it's been just an awful 3 years in the tropics. There were 3 consecutive years of La Niña. Now, La Niña usually means more hurricanes, more landfalls. So these 3 brutal years followed up by 2023, we were kind of hoping for a break in the meteorological community and along the Gulf Coast with an El Nino. So we'll get into what's going on with that in a little bit. Now, that's not typical to get 26 named storm landfalls in 3 years, averaging 8.5 storms per year, averaging 4 hurricane landfalls per year, averaging more than 1 major hurricane landfall per year. That's not normal. This is the normal progression of how many landfalls you can expect on average through a hurricane season. If you go back to about 1900, you would expect about half a major hurricane. So a major hurricane once every 2 or 3 years in the continental US, about 1.5 hurricane landfalls per year. So anywhere between 1 and 3 being normal, and about 3 tropical storm landfalls. And this is kind of breaks it out over the course of the season. You can see the steeper the lines are increasing, that's the busier time of year. So you can see that these lines increase most dramatically between roughly mid-August and late October here. That's the core of hurricane season. Now, if we could kind of zoom in on what's really doing the damage, it's these Category 4 and 5 hurricane landfalls that we've had just a spate of since 2017. 6 Category 4 or 5 US landfalls in the past 6 hurricane seasons, all along the Gulf Coast. And all of these events, they all have taken place between late August at the earliest for Laura and October 10th for Michael, the Category 5 of the bunch in 2018. So it is that peak of the hurricane season that we're in now and will be continuing through mid-October. That's when the concentration of risks in terms of major hurricanes that do the big dollar damages that hurt and kill people, that we're really trying to protect people from those wind, water, and surge risks, that's when they're doing their absolute worst. So this is the time of year when that happens. So this is a nice smooth curve of climatology. If you go back and add up all the storms that have happened in the Atlantic Basin, anywhere in the Gulf, the Caribbean, the open Atlantic, over the past 73 years since 1950, in blue, that's tropical storm, red is hurricane, and yellow are major hurricanes. And you can see we are at this black line. So if you add up what's called accumulated cyclone energy, that kind of takes into account both how strong a storm is and how long it lasts, we are right at this peak, right there at, right here on September 12th is right at the peak. So we are definitively at the peak. No messing around. And we care about this because in terms of landfalls, this is just a bar graph that shows what percentage of landfalls happens per month. And this yellow bar, that's major hurricanes. So we're talking about right around 50% of all major hurricanes that have historically happened in the continental US happen in the month of September. Now, August has about 30 and October has about 20. So those are both months that are important too. Earlier in the season, you do get a lot of weaker storms, those blue bars for being a tropical storm landfall. So we care about storms in June and July. They can especially do extreme precip, which is a major hazard that people need to be aware of. But the major hurricanes, those are concentrated around that seasonal peak. So going into 2023, looking back at 2020 through 2022, this 3-year La Nina, an unusually long La Nina, as forecasters started to make our forecast for how busy the hurricane season was going to be back in the spring, we looked at the expectation of there's probably an El Nino developing this year, and it's likely to be a normal season. Now, this is a graph that shows these key forecast groups, 7 forecast groups from academia and the commercial insurance world and many other governments and other research groups, we're making a forecast of how many units of accumulated cyclone energy are going to form. So a normal season has about 100 units of accumulated cyclone energy. That's the average going back over the last 70 years. So in April, those of us who put out forecasts, including us at WeatherTiger, issued a forecast for right around average for a hurricane season. Now, as we've gone through May, June, July, and August, you can see there has been this trend upward in expectations for the hurricane season. That was driven by increased warming in the tropical Atlantic, and I'll show that later. But by the time August rolled around, the consensus of forecast groups was very much for an above average hurricane season, right up here around 150 ACE, which is about 50% higher than normal. WeatherTiger's dots are these orange and black dots, so we were calling for right around 150 with our August forecast update as well. Now, you did notice that there's a lot of spread, especially in some of those earlier ranges, June and May. And in fact, if you go back and you look at the bigger forecast groups and the hurricane season expectations that come out before the season, this year, so these are years since 2016, and how much spread, how much variance, how different are the forecasts from each other. Out here in 2023, the standard deviation is much higher than any other season. The other years, kind of had this spread of standard deviation of around 20. 2023, we're up here around 40. So forecast groups didn't necessarily agree with each other going into the season. Everybody's kind of trended more active. Some started closer to normal, some started below normal, and everybody's increased, but there's still quite a big deal of spread in between the forecast models. Now, why is this? Well, what we look at as a seasonal forecasters, and this is something we do at WeatherTiger, Phil Klossbach does at Colorado State, they do at NOAA, the European Center, UK Met Office, other places around the world. We all come about our forecasts in a little bit different methodology, but we're all kind of looking at the same general variables. And to really kind of crunch it down to the real essentials here, there's 2 things that are really the most important things that we're looking at. And one is, what is the state of what's called the El Niño Southern Oscillation? So El Niño is basically how different is sea surface temperature from average in this box in the equatorial central Pacific. And it's also kind of associated with this bigger pattern of warmth that kind of spreads out across the eastern Pacific and branches out into the subtropics. But it's kind of this box in here that is used to define the ENSO index. So going into the 2023 hurricane season, you had the development of an El Niño. El Niños have warmer than average water in that equatorial central Pacific. And that really matters because research has shown that El Niño is a key driver of kind of climate worldwide, weather patterns that are kind of, this is sort of the tail that wags the dog here in the Pacific. It has an outsized influence on the weather that you get around the world. The other key thing about El Niño, or its counterpart, La Niña, where the waters in this region are cooler than average, is they tend to persist. The 2022 La Niña lasted all the way into early 2023, and El Niños tend to last for 1 or 2 years. So you have this predictability. An El Niño gets started, it's not going to go away next week. It's going to last for at least 1 winter season, and then they dissipate the next spring. So El Niño 2023 developed early in the summer, and we've since seen continued warming of water temperatures relative to normal in that region that we care about of the Central Pacific. So that is a major predictor of Atlantic tropical cyclone activity. The other thing that we look at is the warmth of the tropical Atlantic itself, because that's what's providing the fuel for tropical cyclones as they develop in the tropical Atlantic and then move out of it. So this is an unusual year because what we have is something that really hasn't happened before, certainly not to the extent and extremity that we have been observing it this year. What we have is a powerful El Niño event. We have water temperatures in the Central Pacific that are about 1.5 degrees Celsius above normal. So that puts us right at the doorstep of what's called a strong El Niño. This isn't a weak event. It's no wimpy El Niño. And we also have water temperatures in the tropical Atlantic that are just phenomenally warm, something across the board warmth of 2 or 3 degrees above normal. It's not something that we've ever seen before in the Atlantic. The tropical Atlantic is by far the warmest it's ever been. So why do we care so much about El Nino and the water temperatures in the tropical Atlantic? Well, because they really, really matter for season outcomes. So this bar graph, the top half of it, divides up the hurricane season since 1900 into 35 years with a La Nina, 58 years where we didn't have an El Nino or a La Nina in place and were neutral conditions, and then there were 30 years when we had an El Nino. And the bar shows how many hurricanes made landfall on average in Florida in those hurricane seasons. And during La Nina years, we're up close to around an average of 1 Florida hurricane landfall per hurricane season. In neutral years, here we are hanging out at about 0.7, and El Nino years, less than half on average. So really modulates the risks in Florida. And this lower panel, I've extended that analysis to be all of the continental United States. And I've kind of broken out by how strong the La Nina was. La Ninas are over here, and then El Ninos are over here. And you can see that there's this nice trend downward in how many hurricanes make landfall in the continental United States that scales just very nicely with how cool the Pacific is here on the left, or warm it is relative to normal. So strong El Ninos, like the one we're in right now, tend to underperform in terms of US landfalls. That's what we really care about. Average US landfalls, less than 1. So, maybe you get a landfall, 2 out of 3 seasons in a strong El Nino event. And you can break this out even further. We can take a look at if you have an El Nino up here on these top 2 plots. So, sorry, El Nino would be above the red line. How did these seasons turn out? Well, 30% of the time during an El Nino, you didn't have any hurricane landfalls in the United States. About 50% of the time, you had 1, and then the rest, the remaining 15% were scattered between 2 and 6. Average about 1. Major hurricanes, 70% of El Nino seasons did not have a major hurricane landfall in the continental United States. A few did, about a third of them did. And you can see this distribution is very different during La Nina years in these bottom 2 panels. The kind of mode of the data is you do get 2 landfalls in the continental United States during a La Nina season, and you have a much better than 50% chance, you have about a 2/3 chance of getting at least 1 or more major hurricane landfalls in the continental United States. So this really modulates the risk. So that's something that is very important, and we look at it carefully to see how the season's going to shake up. So this is a little bit of a busy plot, but if you want to try to understand why El Nino has this kind of effect, this is kind of the mechanism by which that takes place. So these are some key El Nino years that are kind of analogs to this hurricane season, and how the winds at lower levels here on the top panel, so this is lower level and this is upper level winds down here on the bottom panel, shook out relative to normal. And all of these little arrows show that you had stronger than average. The winds in the tropics typically blow at low levels from east to west. And in El Nino years, these years that kind of were close to this one, had strong winds blowing across the Caribbean and a little bit of the tropical Atlantic here. And if you go down to the upper level winds, it's just the opposite. You have winds that are blowing stronger than average out of the east and blowing to the west over the same region of the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic. So if you put these things together, you have what's called wind shear. You have winds at lower levels going like this, and you have winds at upper levels going like this. And tropical cyclones don't like that, because if you have a nice bubbly piece of convection trying to rise, warm air trying to rise through the atmosphere, and you hit these strong upper level winds aloft, it kind of tilts that and shears it in such a way that the thermodynamic engine that runs a tropical cyclone can't get going. Kind of has to retain that heat within a small region, and those strong winds aloft kind of shear it out, blow it away, and it's harder for a tropical cyclone to develop. So that's why El Niños tend to be quieter than average in the Atlantic, especially in the Caribbean, and oftentimes some of the Gulf of Mexico and kind of the central tropical Atlantic as well. So if we go back and we look at some other years that kind of share this, general pattern, this is 2023, and we look at other years that have had this kind of comparable El Nino event. Well, if you look at the ACE is close to average, a little bit above average in this one year, 1951, but 65, 72, 97, well below 100, well below average. So these years have tended to be quieter than normal. Now, question marks for how this year was going to turn out. We've been able to answer some of those questions. We've actually already had more activity already at the halfway point than all three of those seasons, unfortunately. So now I want to switch gears and talk about why we care about the Atlantic. And before I do, I want to talk about something called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which is just in very basic terms, kind of the regions of the Atlantic where hurricanes form tend to have these periods between 30 or 40 years where they tend to either be colder than normal or warmer than average. So we're cold here in the early 20th century, we go warm in the middle of the 20th century, late 20th century through about 1995, we're cold again. And then since 95, we've been warmer than average once again across the regions of the tropical Atlantic where hurricanes often develop. Now, what's that resulted in terms of US hurricane landfall outcomes? Well, these bars that are outlined in blue here are your colder periods. And this is the number of hurricanes in gray or major hurricanes in black, on average making landfall in these eras of Atlantic hurricane activity. And you can see in general, your blue bars are much shorter than the red bars, and the difference is especially noticeable in terms of major hurricanes. You're getting about 50% more major hurricanes making landfall in the continental United States during the warm phases versus the colder phases of the tropical Atlantic. And if we break this out further, in Florida, it's a really dramatic difference here in my home state, and of course one that kind of has the highest climatological risk of hurricane landfall. You're looking at these colder periods where you're only averaging about 1 out of every 10 years seeing a major hurricane make landfall, versus in these warmer cycle years, you're seeing that happen about once every 3 years. So this is a big difference going from low risk to higher risk, back to lower risk, back to higher risk since 1995. So that's why that matters. It's really, really determinant in terms of outcomes, especially kind of more the closer you get to the tropics, the more that is true. So if we identify years in the historical record that are similar to the warmth that we see currently in 2023, it's a hit list or a Hiller's row here of some infamous hurricane seasons: 2005, 2017, 2020. All of these years were very active, 2.5 times normal, 2.25 times normal, almost twice average. 2010 was also a busy hurricane season. It's not one that anybody remembers all that well because a lot of activity happened, but it kind of stayed out in the open ocean. But still, it was about 1.5 times normal activity. So again, how does this year turn out relative to those other years? And I just also wanted to put in on this slide that it doesn't really usually determine whether it's going to be a busy or quieter year, but something that is certainly alarming and certainly is close to the continental United States and can ramp up US landfall risks in the shorter term, or Gulf temperatures. And the Gulf is just absolutely on fire this year. So this is sea surface temperatures from Brian McNulty at University of Miami. This is as of 2 days ago. And this is these reds and these yellows, they're all over 30 degrees Celsius. So this is your water temperatures anywhere from 85 degrees up to 90 or more, kind of in these whites and purples out here in spots. And this is truly remarkable because as a hurricane moves over warm waters, it churns up cooler water from depth. So you can see here in the Eastern Gulf, kind of you can use your imagination and see that track of Idalia that moved from the Yucatan Peninsula and then north across the Eastern Gulf and here into Florida's Big Bend. Well, that cool wake in that Idalia has left behind 2 weeks later, we're still talking about water temperatures that are 86 or 87 degrees, which is crazy. It's still warmer than normal even after a major hurricane came and turned up that water. It just moved too quickly and the warm water was too deep. So putting these two things together, this is a dot plot that plots El Nino and La Nina on the y-axis. So the Pacific, the stronger the El Nino, the further you are upwards. The stronger the La Nina, the further you are downwards on this plot. The x-axis is the Atlantic. Colder Atlantic temperatures are here on the left side of the plot. Warmer Atlantic temperatures are on the right side of the plot. And the color of the dots indicates how active each hurricane season was for where it wound up in this phase space. And you can see the hyperactive years of hurricane season cluster here in this lower right part of the plot, which is warm Atlantic and La Nina. These oranges also kind of cluster there too. Those are above average seasons that don't quite get to hyperactive. The blue years, the blue dots are quieter than normal hurricane seasons in the bottom third of historical hurricane seasons. Those blue years kind of cluster over here. Again, that's when the Atlantic is cool and there is an active El Nino. So the further you go up this way, the more you get into that cold water and active and cold water in the Atlantic, warmer water in the Pacific. So where's 2023? Well, it's not anywhere over here with the other years. It's all the way over here in its own little universe, hanging out on the very top right part of the plot. Super warm Atlantic and a quite formidable El Nino at the same time. So the forecast challenge in 2023 was to try to understand which of these factors is going to win. Are they going to fight to a draw? Which overwhelms the other? Does El Nino's wind shear make the environment unfavorable and it doesn't matter how warm the Atlantic is? Or does the warmth of the Atlantic kind of change those circulation patterns in a way that neutralizes those unfavorable conditions that you might expect in a strong El Nino year? And halfway through the hurricane season, we do have at least the start of our answer. So this is a curve showing, this is climatology for the Atlantic as you go through the hurricane season. So this is, you're starting over here, beginning of the season in June, and here we are in mid-September. And this orange line is what we have seen this year in terms of ACE. So right now we're hanging out at about 88 ACE units. 88 ACE units right here. And those dotted lines, that's what the NHC is forecasting is going to happen with active storms in the next 5 days. So in the next 5 days, we're going to go over 100 ACE and we'll be above normal for hurricane season. Now this is the median, this black line that kind of slowly gets up to close to 100 by the end of the season. So we're way above that. We're up here kind of hanging out in the 85th percentile-ish of hurricane season since 1950. And more to go. I mean, it looks like we're going to continue to be active here for the next couple of weeks at least. Now, looking at this in terms of landfalls, we haven't seen a 2020-like spate of landfalls where we're just seeing one landfall after the other, and it's super active. We saw one tropical storm landfall, Harold in Texas, and then this is Idalia. So this is looking at the ACE or net hurricane activity happening over the continental United States. And Idalia was a major hurricane, but it was a fast-moving one. So Idalia basically just brought us right up to around what we would normally expect for ACE through the beginning of the season. So, sitting here from the perspective in North Florida, I'm hard-pressed to say that it's been a quiet hurricane season because I just had a Cat 4 pointed at me. But it could be worse in the continental United States. We could be seeing more activity than we have. 85th percentile for landfalls would put us up here more like at around 5 or 6 ACE units over the continental United States. So, I guess something to be a little bit grateful for in the first half of the season is that it hasn't been worse in terms of U.S. landfalls for the amount of activity that we've had. So the scorecard at halfway, El Nino, as we've talked about, modulates hurricane season net activity through the medium of wind shear. So these are some plots compiled by NOAA that show, on average, how much wind shear have we had here in the tropical Atlantic. So that's kind of the main development region, from 60 west over towards West Africa, between 0 and 20 north, and then here in the Caribbean. This black line is climatology. It's what normal is. It's what you would expect to happen in an average year. And the blue line is what we've actually seen. So here in the tropical Atlantic, ever since basically the start of the hurricane season in June, we have been consistently below normal for wind shear across the tropical Atlantic. Very few windows, brief windows, where there was more shear than average. And that has, that's why we've seen quite a bit of development in that main development region of the tropical Atlantic and then going north into the subtropics. And the real surprise is here in the Caribbean, where that relationship is strongest, where you would expect an El Nino to be producing the most shear relative to normal. The record here too, it's a little more mixed. There's some periods here in July, mid-August, where we did see above normal shear, but on the whole, here too in the Caribbean has been below normal. And this is where we saw the development of Idalia in the northwestern Caribbean in the last week of August. Shear was below normal. It was a very favorable environment for the storm to develop and then move north. So El Nino did not produce. It did not help me out one bit here in North Florida and keep the hurricanes away, as you might expect, just given that piece of information that we're in a strong El Nino. The Atlantic appears to be modifying that pattern somewhat in a way that makes tropical development more likely. So this is a figure that Dr. Phil Klotzbach from Colorado State University, another foremost practitioner of seasonal hurricane forecasting and a heck of a guy, good friend of mine, put together. So this is the average wind shear between August 8th and September 6th. And areas of blue in this plot are areas where wind shear was below normal through the month approaching the peak of hurricane season. So the Caribbean has less shear than normal. The tropical Atlantic out here, it's close to average. And then you've got this region of the subtropics that was quite favorable as well. Another thing that helped get a lot of tropical cyclone activity going is a pulse of something called the Madden-Julian oscillation. It's basically kind of an upper level wind pattern that moves from west to east and creates these regions where convection is favored or not favored. So in green on this plot, it's a little hard to tell, but you can see this is going forward with time. So things that are moving kind of down and to the right are moving east with time. And this green region, that's where there was this kind of rising motion over the Atlantic. So the Atlantic is kind of this chunk in here. Everything over here is between kind of 90 west and to 20 west. So this green intersecting the region of the Atlantic late in August going into early September, you can see all these little symbols, and every single one of those symbols is where a tropical cyclone developed. So that upper level winds being more favorable than average, they kind of help bring the shear down, and they help give that first half of hurricane season a pop, give storms a little bit of a boost as they develop. Right now, we're going into a time frame where you can see this region of brown is moving down and to the right, and that's a region where upper level winds are less favorable for convection. So maybe we're going to get a little bit of a break going forward here with time. But then if you go even further out, there kind of is this other wave that looks like it's taking shape of moving back into maybe more favorable conditions in the Atlantic late in September or early October, which is a bit alarming because hurricane season is not over in September. It does not end at the end of September. There's quite a bit of risk in October as well. We'll show you exactly where that is in just right here. So what I've done is broken out every dot on these four maps is a place where a tropical storm, hurricane, or a major hurricane in black has made landfall in the continental United States since 1900. And I've broken this out by quarters. So this is the first quarter of landfall activity in the continental US, second, third, and fourth. So quarters are not created equal. The first quarter goes from the start of the season through mid-August. And then the second quarter, as we near the peak, goes from about mid-August through the first week of September. So now we're in the third quarter, and this is the third quarter only lasts about 2 weeks because it's the peak of the season. rates of landfall are the absolute highest here in the peak of the season. So I'm going to talk about the rest of the year, but I'm going to break it into two parts. I'm going to break it down by talking about the third quarter that we're in right now, where we can kind of look at the pieces on the map, the hurricanes on the map, try to make sense of what we see and what the risks are in the near future. And then we'll take a look at the fourth quarter that starts here the last week of September going forward, and see what can be said about that. Now, one interesting thing is that if you look at hurricane history, so Idalia made landfall as a major hurricane right about here, not really a time or a place where you would expect a hurricane to be making landfall. The Florida Gulf Coast is not typically favored for hurricane landfalls here in late August. That's a weird one. The part of Florida that's more favored for landfalls historically is South Florida. And that continues into the third quarter. You see this cluster of major hurricanes landfalls, and you see another cluster of major hurricane landfalls over here in Texas and Louisiana. And kind of the historical storm track associated with that, storms coming from the east, and they roll through the Gulf, and then they roll up towards the Western Gulf. Typically, there tends to be pretty strong high pressure guiding those storms around that ridge, and that's the favored track. So let's see. Let's take a look at what's going on right now and see how that matches up with that historical risk. So these are the hurricane centers, cones of uncertainty as of this afternoon for major Hurricane Lee, Hurricane Margot out here in the open Atlantic, and then a tropical wave that has an 80% chance of developing further out in the tropical Atlantic as well. So of these, we really just Lee is pretty much it in terms of risks to the continental United States. And the reason for that, so we go to the next panel, this is kind of, for to put it simply, this is sort of how the jet stream lines up over the next couple of weeks. So there's this dip over the eastern United States, and then this ridge over the subtropical Atlantic. And this trough of low pressure over the eastern United States, the steering winds that a hurricane feels around it, as you're approaching a trough, kind of turn from east-west as you're going around this ridge to more north-south oriented. And then you kind of pick up into the jet stream, and the storms turn north and away from the continental U.S. So over the next 2 weeks, this is just the GFS ensemble over the next couple weeks, and you can see that troughing is over the eastern United States initially, and then it kind of moves out into the western Atlantic. And that's good news, because we've got, it's going to be a close shave here with Lee, stopping the clock, and it's kind of getting squeezed between this high and this low, moving north. It's going to have some pretty significant rain and wind impacts here on eastern New England, especially Maine into Atlantic Canada. We'll see if the impacts get as far west as New Hampshire, eastern Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Certainly, we're talking about wave impacts all up and down the East Coast, coastal flooding impacts, but we'll see how far those gale force winds get inland. But Lee is not going to be moving west. It's not going to be, not moving towards Florida. It's not moving towards North Carolina. It's not even coming up like Irene did towards New York City. It's going to be a glancing blow for the U.S. And it's probably also going to be doing this as a storm that's more taking on the characteristics of a nor'easter, not a purely tropical system. What you think of as a hurricane, where you've got this core of intense winds around an eye, Lee's not going to look like that at all this weekend as it's approaching New England. It's going to be big. It's going to be spread out. It's not going to have a core of intense winds, but it's going to have a 600-mile wide swath of 40 to 50 mile an hour winds. So that's certainly going to produce plenty of impacts over the continental United States. Don't mean to downplay that one bit. But these other storms that are developed out here in the main development region, they're likely over the next couple of weeks to turn north into the open Atlantic, well east of the continental United States. And we don't really see anything else closer in here. This part of the Atlantic isn't super favorable for development right now. To the south of this trough, there's a lot of shear. So we're kind of in good shape as we're going through the third quarter here. The third quarter, I think we're going to get through it with a glancing blow to eastern New England, but we're likely not going to get this, a Texas major hurricane or a South Florida major hurricane over the next 10, 12 days. I just don't see that in the cards, even with Margot and potentially another storm behind that developing. Now, going forward into the fourth quarter, this is a trickier forecast because if you know the places that are impacted by storms historically in this last quarter of the hurricane season are quite different. We really start to wind down the hurricane season in Texas in late September. Not a lot of hurricane landfalls in Texas late in the season. Do still see some in Louisiana and the Central Gulf, and then we see this big upswing in impacts here in Southwest Florida and kind of the East Central Gulf Coast. And that's because, as I'll show on the next slide, the places where hurricanes develop, it changes dramatically between August, September, and October. So I'll try to pause here. Oh, forward, and then I really messed myself up. Great. Back from where it was. Back here. Sorry, everyone. There we go. Okay. So in August and September, you see there's a great deal of development out here in the tropical Atlantic. And each of these yellow dots is where a major hurricane developed. But when you go forward into October, you don't see that anymore. Wind shear starts to pick up out here, and it just is not a favorable place for storms to develop. You can get some, but they tend to kind of be delayed, and maybe they'll develop a little closer in towards the United States. But the big region of development is kind of the southwestern Atlantic, Caribbean, eastern Gulf of Mexico. So that's your risk box. That's where your risks are coming from in October. Flows in to the continental United States, trough dips down, pulls this storm up and north, and that's why you have all these landfalls in Southwest Florida. I mean, honestly, Ian is a good example of this, although it was in late September, September 29th. Ian developed in the Caribbean, loops up this way through Fort Myers region, Charlotte Harbor, and that's your track. So, it's just the region where they develop. They're not developing out here and kind of moving all across the Atlantic towards South Florida. They're developing in here, and then fronts and troughs pick them up and move to the north. So if we look at the kind of historical risks to Florida specifically, so this is on that same climatology plot I showed at the beginning, except it's just Florida. This is just tropical storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes that have made landfall in the state of Florida. You do see this peak here in mid-September. So plenty of storms have made landfall in South Florida in the peak of hurricane season. Definitely want to watch out for that, but doesn't look like it's going to happen in the next 10 days. You do see then this secondary peak of Florida hurricane risks. And this, you see major hurricanes peak here, they go down a little bit, and then they go back up as you go into mid-October. So you got to watch out along the eastern Gulf Coast for sure in that last quarter of hurricane season, because hurricane season is not over on the Gulf Coast. So going forward into that last quarter, what do we see right now? Well, it's pretty alarming, to be honest with you. This is what's called tropical cyclone heat content, or oceanic heat content. And it's an integration of not only how hot the surface water is, but how deep those waters go. So all these reds, oranges, magentas, they're regions of very warm water and very deep water. And that's a perfect setup thermodynamically to get major hurricane activity. So Northwestern Caribbean, just smoking. And the Eastern Gulf, it hasn't even, Adelia barely even touched it. Really you only need maybe, 20 kilojoules per cubic centimeter to power a major hurricane. And boy, we have that in spades. It hasn't gone anywhere. So lots of fuel, lots of potential, and even going out here into the open Atlantic as well. Shear, well, it's tough to forecast weather. You can really only forecast day-to-day weather 10 days ahead of time. You can't make predictions 58 days ahead of time. The atmosphere is just too chaotic to tell you if it's going to rain on a particular day 3 months from now. Now, we do have climate models that kind of run out into the medium term, and it's called sub-seasonal modeling, where we're making projections between 3 and 6 weeks ahead of time. So this is the U.S. model for doing that. It's called the CFS. And these regions that are outlined in red and orange are areas where shear is expected to be above normal going forward here into September and October. So we start out with a lot of shear over the Gulf of Mexico, not a ton of shear here in the tropical Atlantic. we do see a little bit of an uptick, these kind of light oranges. There's a little bit of a signature that this kind of shear axis that's been over the Gulf kind of drops south a little bit into more of its normal position, but it's not that strong of a signal. And CFS is not a fail-proof tool. Let me tell you, it's this is kind of a weak signal, and it's not something that I would particularly trust. So I certainly don't see the kind of strong signal that you would expect to see with subseasonal forecasting in a strong El Nino year. So maybe there's a little bit of traction that El Nino will start to get as we go into the late fall months and things to maybe normalize a bit, but I certainly wouldn't count on it given the signals that we're looking at. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is, that steering pattern. What makes for hurricane threats to Florida in October? And it really is October. It is the eastern half of the Gulf as well, but I'm kind of just focusing on Florida because that's where the risk locus tends to be late in the season in that last quarter. So, what patterns preceded major hurricane landfalls in the state of Florida? So if you go back and you look at that, essentially what you see is there's this ridge over central Canada. There's a ridge of high pressure over the northern Atlantic. And then you have this kind of pattern where there's a dip in the jet stream that's trough in through here. Storms develop here. The steering currents pick them up and turn them north and east. So that trough over the East Coast is kind of key to getting storms to come up out of the Caribbean. If you were to say have a ridge here, you would keep those storms moving west into Central America or the Mexican Gulf Coast or out into the Eastern Pacific. So this is kind of what Octobers have looked like in some of the other years that are fairly similar to 2023, at least in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. And we do see that there is kind of this tendency for troughing. It's not perfectly over the East Coast. It's a little bit further out in the Western Atlantic, but there is this signature of this ridge out here over the Northern Atlantic, and there's also a ridge here in the Northern Plains. It doesn't extend quite as far into Canada in this selection of years, but in general, we do expect that there will be periods of troughing over the eastern United States in the month of October. These El Nino falls do tend to be a little bit cooler than average as we go into October, so that progression of fronts will probably start to come down here over the eastern third of the U.S. and potentially, that would pick up something. And if it develops in the Caribbean, maybe there would be a tendency for it to kind of branch off to the northeast. Anyway, just something to watch. This is, shadows on the cave wall type of stuff. This is not perfect, but it is just a little bit of a preview of, if there was a strong tendency for ridging over the East Coast, I'd be feeling a lot better in those, kind of looking at those similar years in the past. So putting it all together, here at WeatherTiger, I actually run a daily update to my hurricane season outlook that kind of takes a snapshot of the ocean and atmosphere, cross-references with how much activity has occurred already in the hurricane season, how much the Hurricane Center expects in the near future. And our model, again, it started out here in May, close to average, and then it's just steadily crept up the hill like the mountain climber in the Price is Right, up to around 150% of normal by the end of July, and then has kind of bounced around as storms have developed and generated ACE. And as of the end of last week, it was the highest it had ever been, up at around 170, but kind of this range between 140 and 170 is where we've been bouncing around. And that leaves the options on the table as a hyperactive season, maybe slightly more likely than not above average season is very probable. You can't have a below average season anymore because we've already blown past what a below average season would be here at the halfway point, and even a near normal season. Things would have to basically stop after the next week, and we'd have to see no more activity to stay in that near normal range. So that's a model that we run every day at WeatherTiger. You can go to weathertiger.substack.com and check it out. Although not right now because I have a data input that's broken. So I'm going to be trying to get that back up and running in the next couple of days, but it will be interesting to see how it copes with the expectations for shear and sea surface temperatures and heat content over the remainder of the hurricane season. So far, it corrected in the direction of Atlantic SSTs overwhelming the El Nino influence And unfortunately, it's been right about that as well. And we weren't the only ones to be right about that. Most of the other forecast groups too, as you saw, increased their forecasts over time. So surprisingly, given how weird of a year this was, how far away from kind of the training conditions for our models, seasonal hurricane forecasting has been good this year. It's been pretty much on the money. So last slide, 2023, it's been a major prediction challenge. There's been a very unusual combination of forecast factors with that unusual heat in the Atlantic, coupled with a strong El Nino. Here we are at the halfway point. What can we say? Well, we're going to be above average for this hurricane season, above average plus. We'll see how big that plus is. I will say that looking at the next couple weeks, does not look like steering currents are particularly favorable for U.S. landfalls in September, at least through mid-September. I think Margot, the next storm to develop, they're going to be offshore, somebody watch for Bermuda, Atlantic Canada, but not looking like a threat to the southeastern U.S. or the Gulf. And then the big question for that last quarter of hurricane season, is the shear going to show up? It's been MIA for the hurricane season so far, but we have a strong El Nino in place, and it always could pop in anytime now. Tapping my watch to try to get it going here. If it does develop, you might have fewer storms than average in October because their breeding ground in the Caribbean would be more unfavorable than normal, and as in a normal El Nino year. But if not, the hurricane season could stay very busy through that last quarter. There's plenty of heat content. There's not a strong signal that we're going to get that shear. Steering currents are such that I would be concerned about threats coming out of the Caribbean and into the Gulf or developing in the Gulf. And additional Gulf threats are certainly a possibility as we go into that last quarter of hurricane season. Can never be certain in this business. I would say the overall forecast for the second half of the year is more uncertain than usual. But certainly if those factors align to create another major hurricane, as they did with Idalia 2 weeks ago, it only takes one. It only takes another one in this case. So that's it. That's what I have. I hope you've been able to follow along. And if you want to get in touch with me, just drop me a line. Ryan@weathertiger.com is my email. And I have a newsletter that comes out through Substack, weathertiger.substack.com. There's a free email list. You get a free weekly column. And then there's a supporter tier where you're getting a daily bulletin. And I like to throw in some dad humor as well to keep it interesting, keep myself sane here on the Gulf Coast. It's tough to do. All right, well, I will stop there and address questions.
Ryan, that was awesome. That was a great presentation. I learned so much about it. I had so many questions, and you answered them. You answered them all of the questions I had. So we have about 5 minutes left. If you can give like a 1 minute answer or less to these, I'll just go through what the attendees have been asking. James asked what models have been performing best so far and which ones have been performing worst that you've seen.
So I'm assuming that question relates to kind of the weather models that are forecasting the tracks of individual storms.
Yes.
Sure. Well, actually, if you look at the average errors so far this hurricane season, they're quite low. The Hurricane Center track error is actually lower than the 5-year average pretty significantly. And the model errors are kind of lower than normal too. In the storm that counted, to me, Idalia, the big one that's made landfall in the U.S., I would say that the Euro generally did better than the GFS, and kind of the GFS derived hurricane models like HWRF, the HAVS models. They had some significant successes with intensity forecasting, but the track, as with Ian last year, was biased north and west. Not as dramatically with Idalia as with Ian, but there certainly was that bias that showed up as well. And I really cared about that bias this time because the Hurricane Center forecast track for Idalia was dead on. It was never outside of Levy, Dixie, or Taylor counties. Those 3 coastal counties in Florida, every NHC forecast track was within those counties, and it made landfall in eastern Taylor County. So NHC forecast got it exactly right. But there were a lot of runs at the GFS and HAFS and HWRF that took Idalia further west, and it took the core of the hurricane directly over uh, Tallahassee, which was alarming to a Tallahassee resident. I live 20 miles from the Gulf, so I'm not in the storm surge zone, but core of a major hurricane is not where you want to be. So I would say that the Euro is doing well with track, and I would say that the hurricane models like HAFS and HWRF are doing better with intensity as usual.
So Jonathan asks, given the El Nino and East Coast troughing, has South Florida's hurricane threat decreased into October? And I think you addressed that it still remains a very elevated chance, right?
Yes. So, I mean, two-part answer to that. South Florida, the southeast coast of Florida, so, kind of like Palm Beach, south into Miami, the storms that come from the east, those are the ones that you expect in September or August. And we're not going to get one of those this year. So in terms of Miami just taking a 1926 style direct hit from a Category 4, not likely. We're going to go past the time frame when that normally happens anyway. Hesitate to never say never. Climatology seems like it's a decreasingly good guide. The past doesn't seem to be predicting the future very well as we mess with the climate. But South Florida, there's that flip side where the higher risks for Southwest Florida, the risks actually increase as you go through September and into October for landfalls in Southwest Florida. And many of those events, because they're moving northeast, they can have major impacts on Southeast Florida as well. Classic case, Wilma in 2005 is making landfall near Naples, moving northeast as a major hurricane. It was a tremendously damaging event in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, all along the Florida East Coast. So certainly South Florida still at risk from that October pattern. I would say that I'm not seeing right now anything that would indicate that we would have a direct landfall in Southeast Florida.
Kylie asks, how often do we see the development of Central American gyres during strong El Nino seasons?
Well, so Central American gyres, just to orient the audience, there's kind of 2 times of year when you can get these big areas of turning that kind of span the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, and you get these big circulations, 1,000 miles wide. It's not a hurricane, it's not a tropical storm, it's just this big general area of turning kind of centered over Central America. That's common in June and early July, falls off in the middle of the hurricane season, and then gets more active, more common again as you go towards October. In El Nino years, they tend to be less common than normal, just because of you're basically the trade wind patterns don't really favor that happening. You do get some, I mean, they certainly happen anyway, but it's not as common. Now, Idalia's genesis was from a Central American gyre in late August, which again, super weird, not normal. You don't typically see that as a motogenesis in August. Michael in 2018 developed from a Central American gyre in early October, far more typical in terms of timing. That was also a weak El Nino year, a weak El Nino year, much weaker El Nino year, and you did see that CAG genesis then. So, because we're not really seeing the typical trade wind patterns here in the Caribbean, I wouldn't draw too many conclusions about CAG frequency from that going forward. I just don't really trust history to be a good guide here for the next month until more typical El Nino patterns lock in worldwide.
And then just my last question here. We had a couple of people say that your newsletter's great, your writing is excellent and hilarious, so they're thanking you for what you do. Lauren asks, any thoughts on a hurricane potential for Mexico for the rest of the year?
Well, I certainly wouldn't rule it out, because if we go back to, let me go back one slide here, 2 slides. Right. So if you're looking at this pattern, for October, you do have this ridge kind of centered over the central U.S. and then troughing out here. if you do get something that develops a bit further west, it may continue moving west-northwest into Mexico here in late September or into October. That certainly happens as well. So, it's split. I certainly would say if this was a more normal El Nino year, I would say, below average risks along with the rest of us on the Gulf Coast. In this season, we're kind of balanced pretty close to the tipping point of which way something that developed in the Caribbean or the Southern Gulf might go. I wouldn't rule it out. I probably would say at this point, close to normal risks for Mexico for the rest of the year. So probably not a very satisfying answer, but this hurricane season just hasn't had many of those, has it?
I know, and I'm gaining that it is a peculiar year for sure for predicting and then also watching it unfold.
Yeah. No, I mean, and we've already been under the gun once in Florida, but it could certainly happen again. I hope
Ryan,
not.
thank you so much. This has been excellent. I've learned so much from it, and hopefully the audience has as well. So thanks for your time today.
Great. Thanks so much. And if anybody has any other questions, just drop me a line, Ryan@WeatherTiger.com.
All righty. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your time and work and your experiences with us. And the information is super valuable and super engaging too. It drew me right in. And yes, audience, thank you also for joining us today. Please remember that all webinars will be available to all Weatherband members at amsweatherband.org just as soon as I can process all the video stuff and everything. So hang in there. If you do have any further questions, though, if you want to talk about the webinar, members are welcome to discuss on the Weatherband Community Forum. And I'm going to put a little link here in our chat about if you would consider joining our AMS webinar mailing list to hear about any and all of our upcoming webinars. So let me just really quickly take care of that here. And where did I go? Here we go. All right, so there is that information with a link there if you are so interested. And yeah, I think yes, Ryan and Steve, any parting words for the audience? Be careful,
no,
keep a weather eye out.
No, I know. I was glad you mentioned where Idalia formed because I was, that was originally down by like Costa Rica and Central America, and it was like a week later that all of a sudden it was right on your doorstep, Ryan. So the Hurricane Center's been doing excellent. I would just encourage you to have those sources and check in, now. And you were showing those maps, Ryan. That was basically when I started working at Weather Nation in 2017, and we had just ended a drought of hurricanes from the mid 2000s, to the mid 20 teens. And it's been so busy since. So I've seen, I don't know, whether the 2020 season was just wild. So nothing surprises me anymore. So I would just always reassure people to keep watching, even though we're past the September 10th, 11th peak of the season.
Yeah, it's not over till it's over. We had a hurricane landfall in Florida last year on November 9th, 10th, sometime in the second week of November. So it's not over till it's over, and I wouldn't take anything for granted this year. Boy, I sure do miss that landfall drought. I actually wrote a paper about it. It was nice to have time to just, write papers about stuff and have some leisure time.
Those good old days.
Good old days.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, again, thank you very much. And with that being said, we will conclude our presentation today. Take care, everybody. Have a great evening, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Goodbye.
All right. Good night.